What happens when the mind of a king doesn't break, but cracks? Not with the loud bang of tyranny or conquest, but with the quiet, strange, and delicate sound of shattering glass. History is full of kings who were great, and kings who were cruel, kings who built empires, and kings who lost them. But tonight's story is about a king who was simply afraid of a loving embrace, afraid of a chair that was too hard, afraid that his own body, the vessel of all the power in France, was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. This is the story of Charles VI, the man they would come to call the Glass King, ... The answer to how such a thing could happen. It isn't found in the grand chronicles of war or the dry treaties of diplomacy. It isn't shouted from the ramparts of a castle. No, the answer is found in much quieter places, in the soft footsteps of a loyal servant down a long, cold hallway, in the rustle of straw laid down on the floor to quiet the world, and in the silent, fearful thoughts of the king himself as he sat alone in the twilight. And so tonight, in the peace of this room, we will listen for those quiet things. We will feel that gentle, strange chill, and try to understand the heart of the Glass King, ... Well now, friends, welcome back to Sleepy History Narratives. Find your comfortable place. Let the noise and the light of your own world fade away. Allow your eyes to gently close and your body to settle into the softness of your bed or your favorite chair as we begin our journey back to 14th century France. If you enjoy these quiet explorations into the forgotten corners of history, perhaps consider a gentle tap of the like button. It helps these stories find others who might need a bit of peace. And we'd be honored if you'd subscribe to join our small community of sleepy history lovers. Our story tonight begins, as so many do, in a palace, the Louvre in Paris. But it is not a place of celebration. The great feasts are over. The courtiers have retired. The air grows still and cool. This is a palace at twilight, a place of deep shadows and long, echoing hallways, where the weight of a crown feels heaviest, and the mind of a king is left alone with its own quiet fears. But the quiet, fearful man we see in the twilight of the palace, he was not always so. Let's turn back the pages just a little to remember the king he was in his youth, before the shadows began to gather. In the early years of his reign, he was not known as the Mad King or the Glass King. He was known to his people as Charles le Bien Aime, Charles the Beloved. He was a young king, full of enthusiasm and a desire to rule well won. He was handsome, athletic, a lover of hunts and grand tournaments. Let's imagine being a citizen of Paris then, standing in the crowded square. You look up at the palace balcony and see him, a young man with a confident smile, waving to his people. You see only promise. You see a golden age. You would feel a swell of hope, wouldn't you? A belief that the future of the kingdom is bright and secure in his strong, capable hands. He was not just popular. He was a good king. He made efforts to reform the government, to push back against the greed of his powerful uncles who had ruled. While he was a boy, he listened to his advisors. He seemed destined for greatness. Looking at this vibrant young man, this beloved king in the prime of his life, it is almost impossible to imagine the strange, fragile ghost he would later become. It is a quiet reminder that the strongest crowns rest on the most human, and sometimes the most breakable of minds. To truly know a king, you cannot just see his public face. You must see him in the quiet moments. And no one saw those moments more clearly than the men who served him in private. Men like his loyal attendant, the one whose memories will guide our story tonight. My name is not important. It will not be written in the great chronicles of France. I am not a lord, nor a knight, nor a bishop. I am simply a man who has served the King, Charles VI, since he was a boy and I was not much older. My role is a quiet one. I am his valet, his attendant. I do not advise him on matters of state or war. I am merely there to ensure his cup is full, his fire is warm, and his chambers are quiet. It is a position of great trust, and it has granted me a view of the king that few others ever see. I see the man, not the monarch. I see the small, weary sigh he gives when he takes off the heavy crown at the end of the day. I see the genuine joy in his eyes when he speaks of a successful hunt. I see the weight of the kingdom settle on his young shoulders, and at night, when the great palace of the Louvre is finally still, I write in a small, leather-bound book. By the light of a single candle, I record what I have seen. Not the grand pronouncements or the royal decrees, but the small, human moments that make up the true story of a life. If you were in my position, with this private view of the most powerful man in the land, what would you choose to remember? The magnificent ceremonies and the grand feasts, or the quiet moments of doubt, the unguarded sigh he makes when he believes no one is watching? The answer, I think, says much about a person's soul. Lately, however, I write for a different reason. I write because I am afraid. A strange wind is blowing through the corridors of the palace, a chill that has nothing to do with the winter outside. It is a wind that seems to blow from within the mind of the king himself. I see a shadow in his eyes where there once was only light, and I fear this shadow. This story I am now beginning to tell truly began one hot summer day in the dark woods of Le Mans. It was a hot August day. The king and his retinue were riding through the dense forests of Le Mans. The air was heavy and still. The only sounds were the lazy buzz of insects and the soft clinking of the horses' harnesses. Suddenly, a ragged, wild-eyed man, a leper, darted from the trees, shouting that the king was betrayed. The guards pushed him aside, and the procession rode on, unnerved by the strange encounter. A few moments later, a young page, drowsy from the heat, nodded off, and accidentally dropped the king's lance. It clattered loudly against the steel helmet of the knight beside him. That sharp, metallic sound was the key that unlocked the madness. In an instant, the king, our beloved Charles, was transformed. His body went rigid. His eyes, which had been heavy with the afternoon heat, were suddenly wide and full of a wild animal terror. He drew his sword, and with a terrible cry of treason, he charged. He charged not at an enemy, but at his own men, his own loyal knights. He saw traitors everywhere. The men, in their shock and horror, could do nothing but try to evade the desperate swings of his sword. They could not strike back at their king. And so I watched, frozen in disbelief, as our king, our hope, became a cornered animal, lashing out at shadows only he could see, his voice a raw scream of paranoia and fear. Too, the first great crack had appeared, and we all knew, in that terrible, sun-drenched moment, that nothing would ever be the same again. The journey back to Paris was a silent, funereal procession. The king, our vibrant Charles, did not ride at its head. He was carried on a litter, his body limp, his face as pale as wax. We, his knights and his attendants, rode with our heads bowed, not daring to speak of what we had witnessed. We were escorting not our king, but a terrible, fragile secret. When we arrived at the Louvre, the news of the king's sudden affliction spread through the palace, not like a proclamation, but like a poison. It moved in whispers, from the guards at the gate to the servants in the kitchen, and finally, into the great halls where the lords of the realm gathered. The first reaction was shock, then confusion, and then opportunity. The great nobles of France, the king's powerful uncles and cousins, who had been resentful of his attempts to rule on his own, now saw their chance. They gathered in shadowed corners, their voices low, their eyes full of calculation. They did not see a sick man in need of care. They saw a vacant throne. They began to whisper of a regency, of taking back the power that they felt was rightfully theirs. A power vacuum was opening at the very heart of the kingdom, and the wolves were beginning to circle. The official story, sent out to the city, was that the king was suffering from a high fever, brought on by the exhaustion of the journey. A simple, believable lie to mask an unbelievable truth. But for those of us inside the palace walls, a new and terrifying age had begun. The age of whispers, the age of uncertainty. We were a ship that had just lost its captain in the middle of a gathering storm, and we were all very, very afraid. While the great lords of France plotted in the shadows, the king himself awoke. But the man who opened his eyes was not the same man who had ridden into the forest of Le Mans. He awoke slowly, like a man surfacing from a deep, dark water. For 2 days he had lain in a stupor, his body exhausted by the fit of madness. We, his closest attendants, watched and waited, praying for his return. When his eyes finally opened, we felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. He looked around the room, at the familiar tapestries, at the morning light streaming through the high window, and his eyes were empty. There was no recognition. He looked at his own brother, the Duke of Orleans, and saw only a stranger. He looked at his wife, Queen Isabeau, and his gaze was as vacant as a winter sky. ... I watched as he slowly sat up in his bed. He lifted his own hands, turning them over and over, front and back, as if they were curious objects he had never seen before. He flexed his fingers, a look of detached curiosity on his face. This was the moment that frightened me more than his rage in the forest. The rage was a wildfire, but this was a cold, empty hearth. The king was home, but the man was gone. ... Then he looked at us, his attendants, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, a voice we did not recognize. And he asked the most terrible question a king can ask. He asked who he was. He could not remember his own name. He could not remember that he was the king. He could not remember the crown, or the kingdom, or the family that was now weeping. Silently by his bedside, the man who held all of France in his hand could not hold on to himself. The fire had passed, and all that was left was the ash, a profound, hollow, and terrifying emptiness. For a time, the king slowly recovered from that first episode. There were weeks of fragile lucidity, and the court, in its desperate optimism, believed the storm had passed. They thought what their king needed was a celebration, a bit of levity, and joy to chase the last of the shadows from his mind. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. A wedding was arranged for one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, and to entertain the court, the king and 5 of his closest, most adventurous young lords devised a surprise. They would disguise themselves as wild men of the woods, creatures of myth and folklore, and perform a dance for the guests. Their costumes were a disaster waiting to happen. They were linen garments sewn to their bodies and soaked in flammable pitch. Then a layer of shaggy flax was stuck to the pitch to mimic the look of wild fur. They were, in essence, dressed as human candles. For safety, it was ordered that no lit torches be brought into the great hall during their performance. The dance began. The 6 wild men, chained together, burst into the hall, howling and leaping, their dance a chaotic, joyful spectacle. The court roared with laughter at the bizarre sight. But in the midst of the celebration, the king's brother and uncle arrived late and drunk. They did not know of the order. Curious to identify the disguised dancers, they came too close, their own lit torches held high. A single spark was all it took. In an instant, one of the costumes caught fire, and because the men were chained together, the fire leaped from one to the next. The hall, which moments before had been filled with laughter, was now filled with the sound of human screams and the terrible smell of burning flesh. The king was saved only because a quick-thinking aunt threw the heavy train of her gown over him, smothering the flames. But 4 of his friends, they burned to death before his eyes. The shock of that night, the guilt and the horror of witnessing his friends burn alive in a game of his own making, was the blow from which his mind would never truly recover. The flames in the great hall were eventually extinguished, but a new fire, a fire of guilt and terror, had been lit in the king's mind. If the episode in the forest of Le Mans was the first great crack in the glass of his sanity, then the horror of the Bal des Ardents, the ball of the burning men, was the hammer blow that sent a web of fractures spreading throughout his soul. The darkness, which before had been a visitor, now became a resident. The periods of lucidity grew shorter, farther between, like small sunny islands in a vast, grey and stormy sea. The deep melancholy, the sudden fits of rage, the long periods of empty, hollow silence, they were no longer exceptions. They were becoming the new, terrible routine of our lives in the palace. The beloved king was gone, lost in the smoke of that terrible night. And the man who remained was a stranger to us, and, most tragically, a stranger to himself. The kingdom of France now had a king whose mind was a fractured and fragile thing, and through those cracks, a new and even stranger idea was beginning to take root, an idea that would come to define his reign and his tragic, unforgettable story. The darkness in the king's mind now had a permanent home, and for those of us who served him, a terrible and impossible question began to form. The kingdom needed a strong leader, but the man on the throne was now fragile, so terribly fragile. Let's put you in that quiet, firelit room beside me. You are a trusted attendant, a friend. One you see the king, your king, lost in a fog of confusion. But you also hear the whispers in the hallways, the ambitious nobles, circling like wolves, seeing an opportunity in this tragedy. The kingdom is vulnerable, and here you have a choice. Do you try to protect the man, to shield him from the heavy weight of his duties, to wrap him in comfort and quiet, and let the great lords rule in his name? Or do you try to protect the kingdom? Do you try to force the king back to his throne, to place the heavy crown back upon his fractured mind, hoping that the routine of power might somehow heal him, or at least hold the realm together? There is no easy answer, is there? To protect the man might be to sacrifice the kingdom. To protect the kingdom might be to break the man. This was the question the court of France would now have to face. But first, they and we had to understand the true, bizarre nature of the new reality that had taken root in our king's mind. The court, in its own way, began to adjust to the king's fragile mental state. They learned to navigate his moods, the good days and the bad. But none of us were prepared for the true nature of the idea that had taken root in the ashes of his mind. I remember the day he first spoke of it. It was a quiet afternoon. The king seemed lucid, calm, though with a deep sadness in his eyes that never seemed to leave him now. I brought him a goblet of chilled wine. It was a beautiful piece of Venetian glass, thin and delicate. He took it, but he did not drink. He simply stared at it. He turned it over in his hands, watching the way the pale winter light shone through it. Then he looked up at me, his eyes wide with a look of quiet, genuine terror. You must be careful with me, Jean, he whispered, his voice trembling. You must be so careful. I did not understand. I asked him what he meant, Your Majesty. He looked from the glass goblet to his own hand holding it, and back again. Because I, he said, his voice barely audible, am also made of glass. And I fear that if you touch me too roughly, I will shatter into 1,000 pieces. I stood there, frozen, not knowing what to say. I thought at first it must be a metaphor, a poet's way of describing his own fragility. But looking into his terrified eyes, I knew, with a sinking heart, that he believed it completely. This was the beginning of the great delusion, the strange, unshakable belief that would define the rest of his life. This was the day that our beloved King Charles VI began to believe that his own body was no longer made of flesh and bone, but of brittle, fragile glass. From that day forward, the world of the court was turned upside down. The king's delusion was not a passing fancy. It became the central, organizing principle of his life, and therefore of ours. His great, new fear was the fear of shattering. Life became a slow, careful dance around a man made of glass. He would refuse to be touched, flinching away from even the most gentle hand on his shoulder. Dressing him in the morning, once a simple routine, became a delicate and terrifying negotiation. He would stand rigid, his arms outstretched, warning us to keep our distance, his eyes wide with panic. Imagine this for a moment. You are his loyal attendant. Your duty is to help him dress. But the king, the most powerful man in your world, believes your touch could destroy him. You reach out with a soft silk shirt, and he recoils. Here is your choice. Do you try to reason with him, to tell him he is made of flesh and blood, and risk sending him into a fit of panic? Or do you play along with his delusion, treating him like a priceless glass vase to keep his fragile mind at peace? He would sit motionless in a single chair for hours at a time, forbidding anyone from approaching, convinced that any sudden movement might send a fatal vibration through his glass-like frame. He refused to sit on hard benches, fearing his buttocks would break. The palace, once a place of bustling life, became a house of whispers and soft, shuffling feet. We were living in a world dictated by a beautiful, terrible, and impossible idea. We, his servants, did what we could. We padded the corners of tables. We laid down thick carpets to soften any fall. We learned to move around him as if we were navigating a room full of invisible, paper-thin sculptures. But his fear was a creative one, and soon he would devise an even stranger method to protect his fragile body from the world. I was a simple thing, a thin rod of iron forged in a hot fire, intended perhaps for a door hinge or a piece of fine lattice work. My purpose was to be strong, straight, and unyielding, but I was given a new, stranger purpose. I was brought not to a blacksmith or a carpenter, but to the royal tailor. There I was carefully measured, and other rods were laid beside me. We were, then, with great care, sewn into the lining of the king's own trousers. We became his secret armor, a hidden cage. He believed his legs, his hips, his very being were made of glass, and so we were placed there as an internal reinforcement. We were there to prevent him from shattering if he bumped into a table, or if he sat down too quickly on his own throne. And so my new life began. I felt the warmth of the king's body. I felt the tense, careful way he moved, always aware of his own fragility. I felt his fear. I, a simple piece of iron, became a guardian of a glass king. It was a strange, sad secret. The King of France, a man who should have been wearing steel plate to lead armies into battle, was instead wearing a secret corset of iron rods to protect himself. From himself. It was the ultimate symbol of his private, fragile prison. Asterisk news. Of the king's strange condition, of his belief that he was made of glass, could not be contained within the royal chambers forever. The most learned physicians in all of France were summoned to the Louvre to offer their diagnosis and their cure. They were men of great authority, their minds filled with the wisdom of Galen and Hippocrates. They understood the body as a delicate balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Madness, they believed, was simply a physical imbalance, perhaps too much black bile, causing a deep melancholy, or an excess of hot, dry, yellow bile, leading to fits of rage. They examined the king. They observed his strange refusal to be touched, his terror of sitting down. They listened to his quiet, fearful whispers about being made of glass, and they were utterly, profoundly baffled. Their remedies were all physical. They suggested special diets to cool his humors. They prescribed herbal concoctions. Some likely even suggested bloodletting, the common cure for almost everything, to release the supposed excess of bad fluids. But the king's affliction was not in his blood. It was a sickness of the mind, a concept they had no real name for, no map to navigate. They were trying to cure a shadow. They were trying to put a poultice on a ghost. And so, one by one, the great physicians would leave the king's chambers, shaking their heads, their books of ancient wisdom proving useless. They would whisper in the hallways, their faces a mask of confusion. The king's body was healthy, but his mind was a foreign country to which their science had no visa. They had reached the very edge of their knowledge, and beyond it, there was only mystery. Asterisk, with the physicians gone, the great weight of the king's care fell back upon us, his humble servants, and his immediate family. Since we could not mend his mind, we resolved to do the next best thing. We would protect his glass body. We would remake the world to fit his delusion. The king's royal chambers, once a place of state business and regal splendor, were transformed into a soft, quiet sanctuary, a royal padded cell. Heavy velvet draperies were hung over the stone walls to muffle the sounds of the outside world. Thick carpets from the east were laid upon the floors to soften every footstep. The sharp corners of the heavy oak tables were covered in padded cloth. The great, imposing throne was cushioned with pillows until it looked like a gentle, welcoming cloud. ... Our very movements changed. We learned to walk not with the brisk efficiency of royal servants, but with a slow, gliding step, our feet soft. On the carpets, we learned to speak only in hushed whispers. We learned to never make a sudden gesture, to never close a door too loudly. lest the sound or the vibration cause a crack in our fragile king. It was a strange, surreal existence. We were living in the heart of the most powerful kingdom in Europe, but our daily lives had become a quiet, gentle, and deeply sad performance. We were actors in the king's private play, pretending along with him that he was the most fragile object in the world. We did it not to deceive him, but out of a desperate, loving attempt to grant him some small measure of peace in his tormented mind. We built a safe, soft world for our glass king, but outside his padded chamber, the world was anything but soft. It was a world of sharp ambition and hard steel, and the wolves were gathering at the door. We built a soft, safe world for our glass king, but outside the padded walls of his chamber, the kingdom of France was anything but soft. It was a world of sharp ambition and hard steel. With the king lost in his own fragile mind, a great power vacuum had opened at the center of the court, and the wolves, as they always do, began to gather. They were the great dukes of the realm, the king's own uncles and his brother, men who had long resented Charles for taking back the power they had enjoyed during his youth. Now they saw their chance. While the king sat motionless, afraid to shatter, they moved with a ruthless energy. The whispers in the hallways were no longer about the king's health. They were whispers of alliances, of political maneuvers, of carving up the kingdom's wealth for themselves. They fought over taxes, over lands, over appointments. The court of France, once a symbol of chivalry and order, devolved into a nest of rival factions, each plotting against the other. It was a cruel game of chess they played, and the kingdom was their board, and the king, our king, he was merely a piece in their game, a hollow, glass king, to be moved and positioned to their advantage. They would speak of their loyalty to the crown, of their duty to govern in his stead while he was unwell. But in their eyes, I saw no loyalty. I saw only greed. It was a profound and terrible irony. The king, in his madness, believed he was made of something fragile and precious, and the great lords of his kingdom, in their sanity, treated him as something cheap and disposable. We, his servants, tried to protect the man from a world we padded and softened, but we could not protect the king from the ambitions of his own family. While the great lords of France played their game of power, the king himself became a ghost in his own palace. The great halls, which once bustled with courtiers seeking his favor, were now often silent and empty. The nobles were too busy with their schemes and their factions to spend time with a king who could not advance their ambitions. They needed his signet ring, his royal seal on their documents, but they did not need the man himself. He would spend entire days sitting in a single, heavily padded chair, staring into the middle distance. He was the most powerful man in the kingdom, and yet he was the loneliest. He was the sun around which our entire world was supposed to orbit. But now the planets had decided to spin on their own, leaving the sun to grow cold and dark, alone. In the center of it all, ... There were moments in his lucidity when I believe he was aware of his own isolation. I remember once he caught his own reflection in a polished silver platter. He stared at it for a long time, not with the terror of his glass delusion, but with a simple, profound confusion. And he turned to me and whispered, "Who is that sad old man?" My heart broke, ... He was forgotten. A king in name only, a prisoner in his own home, while the kingdom he was meant to rule was being torn apart by the very men who were supposed to protect it. 3. His greatest fear was of shattering into 1,000 pieces. But the truth is, his The world was already shattering all around him. Asterisk and so, while the great lords played their games of power, my world shrank to the size of the king's chamber. I became not just his attendant, but his companion, his confidant, and the sole audience for the strange theatre of his mind. In the long, quiet hours he would talk, and I, his loyal servant, would listen. He would sit for hours, sometimes, just watching a single glass goblet, as if finding a deep and profound empathy with the fragile object. He saw a kindred spirit in its delicate form. His conversations were a heartbreaking mixture of poetry and paranoia. He would speak of his childhood, of memories of being a young, strong prince, free from the weight of the crown and the terror of his own mind. He would remember the feeling of riding a horse, the wind in his hair, a simple joy he could no longer experience for fear that a single jolt might break him. ... And then he would ask me the questions. The quiet, terrible questions that I had no answer for. "Jean," he would whisper, his eyes full of a genuine, pleading fear. "If I were to shatter, would you gather my pieces? Would you try to put me back together again? Let me ask you, as you lie there in your own safe room, if you were me, what would you say? Would you tell him the truth, that he is made of flesh and blood, and risk shattering his fragile peace of mind? Or would you tell him the lie that his mind so desperately craved? Would you promise to search for every last shard of his glass soul? It is a choice between a kind lie and a cruel truth. I would often just sit with him in silence. Sometimes that was the only answer that felt true. We would sit together, two men in a quiet room, one a king, the other a servant, both prisoners of a strange and sorrowful fate. Asterisk, his life became a long, strange twilight, a world lived between shadow and light. There were the dark days, the days of glass, when he would not know his own name, when he would look upon the face of his own queen and see only a stranger. On those days, he was a king lost in a fog, and our hearts would break for him. But then, sometimes the fog would lift. It would happen without warning. I would enter his chamber in the morning, expecting to find the glass king, and instead I would find Charles. His eyes would be clear. He would look at me, and he would know my name. "Jean," he might say, his voice weak but his own. "Have I been unwell for long?" And in those brief, precious moments, the ghost of the beloved king we once knew would return. He would ask about the kingdom. He would show a flash of his old, kind humor. He would feel a deep, weary sadness for the time he had lost. These moments were perhaps the most painful of all. For him, because he was forced to see the wreck of his own mind, and for us, because we were reminded of the wonderful man who was now so often lost to us. It was like watching the sun break through the clouds for a single, beautiful minute, only to be swallowed again by the endless storm. But we cherished those minutes. They were the proof that our king, our Charles, was still in there, somewhere, trapped inside the fragile, glass prison of his own mind. Asterisk, the sunbeam of lucidity would always fade, and the clouds would roll in again. And so we learned to live in the storm. We, the servants and the family of the King of France, became the keepers of a glass kingdom. Our entire world was reshaped around his fragility. The daily life of the Louvre Palace, once a place of noise and politics and celebration, became a quiet, carefully choreographed ballet of caution. We learned to walk on the balls of our feet, our shoes soft on the thick carpets laid down to muffle our steps. We learned to speak in whispers, to never raise our voices. When we entered a room where he was present, We would announce ourselves gently from the doorway, so as not to startle him. Laughter became a quiet, muffled thing. The grand music of the court was replaced by the soft, distant plucking of a single lute. The very objects of the palace were transformed. Heavy chairs were padded with downy cushions. Sharp corners of tables were draped in thick velvet. Anything that could be a threat to a glass man was softened, moved, or hidden away. It was a world wrapped in wool and whispers. I remember one afternoon, the Duke of Burgundy requested an audience. A powerful, boisterous man, I had to approach the king with the utmost care. "Your Majesty," I whispered, "the Duke is here." The king, who had been sitting motionless by the window for an hour, flinched. His eyes were wide with fear. "Is he loud, Jean?" he asked. "Tell him he must speak softly, and he must not wear his spurs. The sound of them on the stone, it might cause a crack." This was our new reality. A world where the clinking of a spur was as dangerous as a drawn sword. A world where our greatest duty was to protect our king, not from assassins or armies, but from the terror of a single, sudden sound. And in this strange, quiet, padded world, we built for him, the king would sometimes talk. He would sit with me, his trusted attendant, not as a king speaking to a subject, but as one lonely soul speaking to another. And it was in these fragile conversations that I saw the true landscape. Of his mind he would speak of his past, of a time before the glass. He remembered the feeling of being a boy, a prince, not yet burdened by the crown. He would describe the simple, solid joys, the feeling of a powerful horse beneath him on a hunt, the solid weight of a sword in his hand, the simple pleasure of running through a field without a care. His voice would be soft, full of a deep and profound nostalgia for a world that was no longer his. Then the conversation would inevitably turn to his present condition. He would look at his own hands, then at me, his eyes wide with a genuine and heartbreaking question. "Jean," he would sometimes ask, his voice a whisper, "if I were to break, would anyone gather my pieces? Who would put the king back together again?" And I would have no answer. What could I say? If you were there, in that quiet room, what would you choose? To speak the truth, that he is made of flesh and blood, and risk shattering his fragile peace of mind? Or to speak the lie his mind so desperately needed to promise to search for? Every last shard of his glass soul. We, his servants, faced this choice every day. We chose the kind lie. Sometimes he would find a strange empathy in the objects around him. I remember one afternoon he sat for hours, just holding a delicate Venetian glass goblet, turning it over and over in the pale light. He seemed to be in silent conversation with it, as if it were the only thing in the world that could truly understand his unique and terrible predicament. His conversations were few, and his world had become very small. It was a world of soft carpets and padded chairs, and its primary feature was the window. The great leaded glass window of his chamber became his new throne, his council room, and his only true connection to the kingdom he was supposed to rule. He would sit there for hours, a silent, still figure, simply watching the world go on without him. The window, for him, was a perfect and cruel metaphor. It was a barrier made of the very substance he believed himself to be. It allowed him to see everything, but to touch nothing. He could see the seasons change in the palace gardens, the first green shoots of spring, the heavy blossoms of summer, the fall of autumn leaves. He could see the nobles riding out to hunt, their laughter echoing faintly up to his room. He could see children playing in the courtyard. He could see life, but he could not be a part of it. He was a spectator to his own kingdom, a ghost in his own home, separated from the world by a thin, transparent wall, ... And yet, that same window was also his only comfort. It was the only way he could experience the world without the terrifying risk of being jostled, of being bumped, of being shattered. It was his safe portal. On rainy days, he would press his face close to the cool glass, watching the raindrops trace paths down the pane, his eyes full of a deep, quiet melancholy. He was a king in a glass cage, looking out at a world he could no longer join. The window was his prison, but it was also his only freedom. And sometimes, after a long day of silent watching, he would ask for a pen and ink to try and write down the story of the fragile world he saw from the inside. He rarely had the strength or the focus to write for long himself. The thoughts would come and go like fleeting shadows. And so I took up the duty for him. In my small, leather-bound book, with a simple quill pen, I became the secret chronicler of the Glass King. My diary was my only confidant, the only place I could write down the truth of what I saw each day, a truth too strange and too sad to speak aloud in the whispering corridors of the palace. Let me read you an entry from that difficult time. ... Double quote. The king did not leave his chair today for nearly 7 hours. He insisted that a new draft was coming from under the door, and he feared the cold vibration might cause a crack in his ankles. We brought his meal to him on a great silken pillow, and he ate very little. He spent the afternoon staring at his own reflection in a silver cup, turning it over and over as if it held an answer. ... October 19th. A good day, a miracle. The king awoke and knew my name. He asked for his daughter, and when she was brought to him, he recognized her and wept with a quiet joy. He held her hand. He seemed, for a few hours, to be made of flesh and blood again. We all breathed a little easier today. We allowed ourselves to hope. But now, as night falls, I see the fog beginning to gather in his eyes once more. Hope, I am learning, is a heavy and dangerous thing. This book, it was my attempt to hold on to the man I knew, the Charles who was still in there, somewhere. It was a record of the battle for his soul, a battle fought not on a field in Flanders, but in the quiet, padded chambers of his own mind. My little book was filled with the quiet story of the Glass King. But there was another side to his illness, a side that was anything but quiet. Sometimes the fragile glass would seem to melt in an invisible fire, replaced by a sudden, terrifying rage. I remember one day in the council chamber. The king was present, but in his silent, glassy state, sitting motionless at the head of the great table. His ambitious uncles were arguing, their voices rising, their fists pounding the wood. They had forgotten he was even there. A lord, in a fit of pique, slammed a heavy book shut. The sound cracked through the tense silence of the room, like a thunderclap, and it cracked something inside the king. He stood up, his chair crashing backwards onto the floor. But this was not the careful, rigid movement of the Glass King. It was a violent, sudden eruption. His eyes, which were usually wide with fear, were now narrowed with a wild, incomprehensible fury. A raw, guttural roar came from his throat. He was no longer made of glass. He was made of fire. He swept a row of priceless goblets from a side table, sending them shattering across the stone floor. He screamed curses at men who had been dead for 20 years. He lunged at his own brother, his hands like claws, before the guards could rush in and restrain him. And the great lords of France, the powerful men who played games with his kingdom, they fell back in genuine terror. They were afraid. In that moment, they were not afraid of the fragile king, but of the mad one. These fits were rare, but they were terrifying. And in their own way, they were as tragic as his quiet, glass delusion. They were the moments when the pressure inside his fractured mind became too much to bear, and the whole fragile structure simply exploded. After these terrible fits of rage, a profound exhaustion would claim the king. The fire would vanish, and he would return to his fragile, glass-like state, often with no memory of the violence he had just committed. We, his servants, would clean the wreckage, our hearts heavy. But there was one person whose suffering in these moments was perhaps greater than any other, his wife, the Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. She, more than anyone, lived with the tragedy of his fractured mind every single day. For her, it was like being married to 3 different men, all of whom inhabited the same body. There was the first man, a ghost she could only remember, Charles the Beloved, the handsome, charming, athletic king she had married, the man who was the father of her children. She loved this man, I am sure of it, but he was almost never home anymore. Then there was the second man, the one she lived with most often, the Glass King, a man who was like a frightened child, a man she could not touch, could not embrace, for fear he would shatter. She had to care for him, soothe his strange fears, and manage a household, a court, and a kingdom around his profound and bizarre fragility. And then there was the third man, the man of fire and rage, a terrifying stranger who would erupt without warning, who did not know her, who might even try to harm her, a man she had to be protected from. How does a wife navigate such a world? How do you love a man who is at once your beloved, your child, and your monster? I would see her, sometimes, sitting by his bedside after one of his fits. He would be in his glass state, quiet and fearful. She would reach out a hand to touch his, a simple gesture of comfort, and he would flinch, pulling his hand away, afraid that her touch might break him. And in her eyes, in that one moment, you could see the entire tragedy. The love for the man who was gone, the pity for the man who was there, and the lingering fear of the man who might, at any moment, return. It was a sorrow too deep for words. We all adapted to his fragile world. The queen, the servants, the few loyal lords who remained. We built a soft world around him. But the king, in his own strange and fearful logic, did not trust our padded walls and whispered words alone. He believed he needed a more personal, a more rigid form of protection, and so he gave a secret order to the royal tailor, an order that I believe no tailor in history had ever received before. He commanded that thin, strong rods of iron be sewn into the very fabric of his clothes, into his trousers, his doublet, his robes. It was a secret, internal armor, a hidden cage. He reasoned that if he were to fall, or if someone were to bump into him in a crowded hallway, the iron would hold his glass limbs together. It would prevent him from shattering. It was the ultimate tragic paradox. A man who believed himself to be made of the most fragile substance known, encased himself in the strongest. He was a king who feared a gentle touch more than a sword, and so he wore armor against a phantom enemy, a foe that existed only in the labyrinth of his own mind. That hidden cage of iron was the perfect symbol of his life now. He was a prisoner of his own thoughts, living inside a prison of his own making. He lived inside his secret iron-enforced cage, protected from the imaginary dangers of his own mind. But outside the padded walls of the palace, the kingdom of France was truly in danger of shattering, and its enemy was not a phantom. It was very real. While our king obsessed over the fragility of his own body, the body of his kingdom was sick. The 100 Years' War with England raged on, and in France, the king's own family, his uncles and cousins, were so consumed by their own petty civil wars for power and influence that they barely noticed the English lion. Gathering its strength across the Channel, they were fighting over the drapes while the house was on fire. And in the year 1415, the fire came. At a place called Agincourt, a small, weary English army, led by their determined king, Henry V, met a much larger, overconfident French force. The result was one of the most catastrophic defeats in French history. Thousands of our finest nobles, the very flower of French chivalry, were cut down in a muddy field. The news of this disaster filtered back to the Louvre. A wave of grief and shame washed over the kingdom. And the terrible irony was not lost on me. Our king feared a single crack in his own glass body. And while he feared, his kingdom had been cracked in two. He obsessed over protecting himself from an imaginary fall, and his army had truly fallen. We, his servants, had built a safe, soft world to protect the man. But with the king lost in his madness, and the court lost in its own greed, there was no one left to protect the kingdom itself. The Glass King now ruled over a broken land. The news of the disaster at Agincourt echoed through the halls of the Louvre like a death knell. A generation of France's finest nobility had been wiped out. The kingdom was wounded, vulnerable and leaderless, and we, his attendants, had to face the terrible task of telling the king. We approached his chamber with dread, expecting his fragile mind to either retreat deeper into his glass delusion or explode in a fit of terrifying rage. We spoke the news softly, telling him of the battle, of the great loss, and the king. He did not shatter. He did not rage. Instead, something remarkable happened, as if the sheer weight of his kingdom's grief was a force strong enough to pierce the fog of his own mind. The madness seemed to recede. The vacant look left his eyes, and for a few brief, heartbreaking moments, Charles VI, the true King of France, returned to us. He did not speak of being made of glass. He did not scream about traitors. He simply wept. He wept with a profound and lucid sadness. The quiet, bitter tears of a king who understood, with perfect clarity, the scale of the tragedy that had befallen his people under his broken reign. He wept for the fathers and the sons and the brothers who would never come home in that moment. Our mad king was perhaps the sanest man in the entire court. While the dukes were already scheming about how to use the defeat to their own advantage, our king was simply grieving for his lost kingdom. But the weight of that sanity, of that reality, was too much for his fractured mind to bear. The lucid moment passed, as it always did, and the Glass King, the man who feared his own shattering, returned, perhaps as a refuge from the pain of a kingdom that had already broken. Asterisk, asterisk, the lucid moment passed. The King of France was gone again, and only the glass man remained. The grief over his fallen kingdom was too much to bear, and so his mind retreated, seeking refuge once more within the strange, safe prison of his delusion. And it was in the long, quiet nights that followed that a new, quieter kind of chapter began in his life. When the great palace was finally asleep, when the last servant had retired and the last candle was snuffed out, he would often rise from his bed. I would watch him from the shadows of a distant doorway. He would wrap himself in a heavy robe and walk, a solitary figure, out into the moonlight of the palace gardens. He would walk through the gardens, his feet silent on the cool, damp flagstones. The world was asleep, and I believe that in these moments he felt a kind of freedom. There was no one here to bump into him, no one to stare, no one to judge. There was only the moon and the mist, and the company of his own strange thoughts. I would watch him listen to the rustle of the leaves, to the whisper of the night wind, and I often wondered what he was thinking. I imagined him looking at his own fragile reflection in a dark pool of water and asking the night a profound and lonely question. Perhaps we are all made of glass, and the only difference is that some of us have the courage or the curse to admit it. In these quiet, moonlit walks, I believe he found a strange sort of peace, a peace that came not from being strong or from being a king, but from a quiet acceptance of his own profound fragility. It was a sad wisdom, a lonely wisdom, but it was a wisdom nonetheless. He was learning to live with the ghost in his own mind. And though I could not hear the words he whispered to the moon, I sometimes found the proof of his sad philosophy, left behind on his writing desk in the morning. He would sometimes ask for a pen and parchment, and in the deep quiet of the night, when he thought no one was watching, he would write, not royal decrees or matters of state. He would write short, fragmented thoughts, the quiet diary of a glass man. I would find these pages in the morning. The handwriting was not the strong, confident hand of a king. It was a trembling, uncertain script, the letters sometimes faint, as if he were afraid that the pressure of the pen itself might cause a fissure. Let me share one with you. A bird struck the window this morning, he wrote. A small, foolish thing, but the sound of it, the sharp tap against the glass, it echoed inside of me. I was certain a crack had formed along my ribs. I did not dare to breathe too deeply for an hour, for fear my own lungs would push the pieces apart. Another time I found a page that spoke of his dreams. I dreamt last night that I was a farmer, walking barefoot in a ploughed field. I could feel the solid, damp earth under my feet. The warmth of the sun on my back was not a threat, but a blessing. I was not a king, and I was not made of glass. I woke with the memory of that solid earth, and I have never felt such a profound sense of loss. Reading these secret words, I felt as if I were looking directly into his soul. A soul filled not with madness, but with a deep, poetic, and unending sadness. He did not want a kingdom. He did not want a crown. He simply wanted to feel the solid earth beneath his feet once more. His diary was a testament to his secret world, a world of fragile thoughts and quiet fears. But the life of a king, even a broken one, can never be entirely private. Sometimes the outside world, with all its noise and its demands, would intrude. There were days when the feuding dukes, his relatives, would reach a stalemate in their endless games of power. On those days, they needed a king. They needed his presence, his royal seal, to give their own greedy ambitions the illusion of legitimate authority. And so they would summon him to the council chamber. These were the days I dreaded most. The preparation was an ordeal. We would dress him in his finest robes, the ones with the secret iron rods sewn within. His body would be stiff with terror. Every step from his padded chamber down the long, cold hallway to the throne room was a journey of 1,000 miles. Each footstep placed with the careful precision of a man walking on a wire over a great chasm. He would sit upon the throne, a picture of regal emptiness, and the lords would begin their debates, their loud voices echoing in the great hall, each sound a hammer blow against the king's fragile composure. ... I would watch him, to the others. He was just a distant, silent monarch, but I could see the truth. I could see the knuckles of his hands, white as he gripped the arms of the throne. I knew he was not listening to their arguments about taxes or treaties. He was listening to the frantic beating of his own heart, praying that no one would approach too quickly, that no one would speak too loudly. He was a man made of glass, sitting in a room full of stones, pretending he was invincible. They saw a king. I saw a man holding his breath, praying he would survive the scene. It was the saddest and bravest performance I have ever witnessed. The performance was over. The king had not shattered. He would return to his chambers, and a profound, bone-deep weariness would settle upon him. And it was in the deep, quiet hours of the night, when the entire palace slept, that he would often seek his only true solace. I would watch him sometimes, from a high window. He would wrap himself in a dark robe and slip out into the royal gardens, a solitary figure moving through the silver moonlight and the soft, swirling mist. Here, in the sleeping garden, there were no demanding dukes, no frightened servants, no expectations. There was only the quiet company of the ancient trees and the silent, non-judgmental gaze of the moon. He didn't have to pretend to be strong. He didn't have to fear being touched. He could simply be. He would walk for hours, his feet silent, on the cool, damp earth. And I often imagined the conversations he was having, not with me, but with the night itself. I imagined him listening to the rustle of the leaves, and whispering his own fragile philosophy into the wind. ... Perhaps he would ask the darkness, "Is it not true that all of us are made of glass? Is the only difference that I am a king, and so my cracks are visible for all the world to see?" I believe that out there, in the quiet heart of the night, he found a strange kind of peace. It was not the peace of a sound mind, but the peace of acceptance. He was a glass man, living in a hard, stone world. And in the silent, sleeping garden, that terrible truth seemed, just for a moment, to be a bearable, and perhaps even beautiful, thing. He rarely spoke of these philosophies to anyone, not even to me. But sometimes, after one of his long, moonlit walks, I would find proof of his quiet contemplations left behind on his writing desk. He would ask for pen and parchment, and in the deep of the night he would try to write. The handwriting was not the strong, confident script of a king signing a decree. It was a trembling, spidery hand, the letters thin, as if he were afraid the pressure of the pen might send a crack across the page. These were not official documents. They were fragments of a soul. ... I found one such fragment tucked inside a book. A fly, he had written, a simple housefly landed on my hand today. And I did not move. I did not breathe. I sat for what felt like an hour, watching it clean its tiny legs, my entire being a prisoner to the whims of this tiny creature. I was terrified that if I were to flick it away, the sudden motion would surely shatter my wrist. ... Another time, I found a note that spoke of his dreams. a note that revealed the deep and simple longing at the heart of his royal sadness. "I dreamt last night that I was a common man again," he wrote. "Not a king, not a prince, but a boy. And I was running through a field of summer grass, barefoot. I could feel the solid, forgiving earth beneath my feet, and I was not made of glass. I awoke with the memory of that feeling, and I wept, for I fear I shall never feel the solid ground again." These were the secret confessions of the Glass King. Reading them felt like a transgression, a violation of his privacy, but it was also the only way I could truly understand the depth of his quiet, daily torment. He did not dream of power or glory. He dreamt only of being solid, of being whole. After the storms of rage, and in the quiet moments between the tides of his madness, a new and strange calm began to settle over the king. It was not the calm of a healthy mind, but the quiet of acceptance. He had stopped fighting. He had, in his own way, accepted the terrible, impossible truth he had created for himself. He was made of glass, and once he accepted it, he became an expert in his own fragile existence. He knew the world was hard, and so he learned to be soft. He learned which chairs were safe, which hallways were too crowded, which voices were too loud. His life became a slow, deliberate, and careful dance, a constant negotiation between his glass body and a world made of stone. There was a profound, almost philosophical sadness to it. He seemed to find a strange sort of peace in his condition. I believe that for him, his delusion was no longer just a source of terror. It had become a lens through which he saw the world. He would look at a delicate flower, or a thin sheet of ice on a puddle in the garden, and I would see a look of deep, empathetic understanding in his eyes. He saw the fragility in everything. His madness, in a way, had given him a new, terrible kind of wisdom. He understood, in a way no healthy man could, that all life is a fragile and precious thing, always on the verge of shattering. And we, his servants, we stopped trying to convince him he was made of flesh. We learned, instead, to help him be the safest glass man in all the world. Asterisk, and so the years passed. A decade, and then two. The seasons turned outside the palace window, a silent, repeating story of snow and blossom and falling leaves. The king grew older. The lines on his face deepened. His dark hair turned the color of winter frost. The young, beloved king was now a weary, middle-aged man. His delusion, it remained his constant companion. There were still good days and bad days, moments of lucidity, and long descents into the fog. But his life settled into a strange, quiet rhythm, dictated by his fragility. And while he sat so still in his padded rooms, afraid of a sudden movement, the world outside was anything but still. The great war with England raged on. The feuding dukes, his own family, continued to tear the kingdom apart with their greed and their private armies. He feared a crack in his own body, while the body of France was being broken on the anvil of war and ambition. He sat in his quiet, protected world, a still point in the center of a hurricane. He was a king who could not rule, a man who could not live, a fragile glass figure, simply enduring. As the world outside shattered, he, in his own strange way, remained whole. Asterisk, as the years passed, a slow, quiet change came over the king. He was still a man, lost in his delusion, but the nature of that delusion seemed to soften. The sharp, panicked terror that had once defined his days began to fade, replaced by something else, a kind of gentle, melancholic acceptance. He had lived with his glass body for so long now that it was no longer a constant source of surprise or horror. It was simply who he was. He stopped fighting it. He stopped raging against the prison of his own mind. He simply inhabited it. He would still sit for hours, still and silent. But the stillness was no longer the rigid stillness of fear. It was the calm stillness of contemplation. He would watch the dust motes dance in a sunbeam, or the rain trace patterns on his window, and a faint, sad smile would touch his lips. I believe that in the final years of his life, he found a strange and profound peace. It was not the peace of a healed mind, but the peace of surrender. He could not change the fact that he was made of glass, and so he learned to be the most careful, the most gentle, the most observant glass man in all the world. His madness, in a way, had become his monastery. It was a quiet, isolated world where he was free from the brutal demands of being a king, and could simply exist, contemplating the fragile nature of all things. He had accepted his own brokenness, and in that acceptance he had found a strange kind of wholeness. He had found his own strange peace, but history is not always interested in the quiet peace of an individual soul. History remembers kings by their grand titles, their victories, or their failures, and so the world would give our Charles two names. History, in its cold, official ledger, would remember him as Charles the Mad La Fu, a simple, brutal label for a complex and tragic life, a name that speaks only of the chaos and the public fits of rage. But there was another name, a quieter name, spoken not by chroniclers, but by the servants who cared for him, by the people who saw the deep human fear in his eyes. They called him the Glass King. The Mad King is a story of a failed monarch, but the Glass King, that is, the story of a fragile human soul. It speaks not of his madness, but of his profound sensitivity, of a man so finely wrought that the cruelty and the weight of the world literally caused him to crack. I choose to remember him as the Glass King. It is a name that holds not judgment, but a kind of gentle, sorrowful empathy. And so the king grew old, and the long, strange, and sorrowful story of his reign drew to a quiet close. He passed from this world, a man who had worn the crown of France, but who had lived in a prison of glass. History, in its official, way, would remember him as Charles the Mad La Fu. It would remember the battles he lost, the kingdom that fractured under his unsteady hand, the political chaos that defined his time. But that is not the only story. There is another legacy, the legacy of the Glass King. It is a quieter, more fragile legacy. It does not speak of power or of madness, but of a profound and deeply human sensitivity. It is a story that reminds us that we are all, in our own way, a little bit breakable. Let's imagine, for a moment, the light of dawn in the old palace of the Louvre. The morning sun streams through a great stained glass window. A plain, clear window would let in a simple, harsh light, but a window made of many different, colorful, and in a way, broken pieces of glass. It takes that simple light and transforms it into something breathtaking. It creates a shimmering, holy pattern of reds and blues and golds on the cold stone floor. Perhaps the mind of our Glass King was like that. It was fractured, yes, but through those cracks shone a light of uncommon empathy, a deep understanding of what it means to be fragile in a hard world. Sometimes it is our very brokenness that makes us beautiful. It is the cracks in our own souls that let the light get in. Asterisk, so let us remember him that way, not as the mad king of the history books, a symbol of chaos and a fractured kingdom, but as the glass king of the quiet heart, a fragile soul whose strange story reminds us of the profound and sometimes beautiful vulnerability of being human. The story is over now. The long, sad reign has come to a peaceful end. Let the image of the cold, stone palace fade from your mind. Let the whispers of the courtiers dissolve into the quiet of your room. There are no more duties to attend to, no more fears to navigate. There is only the soft darkness behind your eyes and the gentle, steady rhythm of your own breathing. Just listen to that rhythm for a moment. In and out. It is the oldest and most comforting song in the world, the song of rest, the song of peace. Let it be the only thing you pay attention to now. Feel the tension begin to leave your shoulders. Feel your arms and legs grow heavy, a pleasant, warm, and comfortable weight. Feel the softness of the pillow beneath your head, holding you, keeping you safe. There is nothing else you need to do. There is nowhere else you need to be. The story is at rest, and now you can be too. Asterisk, and now let that same peace find you. Let the story fade completely. Let the image of the king and his glass delusion dissolve into the soft darkness behind your eyes. There is no more history to learn tonight, no more stories to tell. The great book of the past is closed, and all that remains is this quiet moment, this safe space. Feel the gentle weight of your blankets. Feel the softness of the pillow beneath your head. Listen to the sound of your own breathing, a slow, steady, and peaceful tide. In and out. Each breath is a gentle wave carrying you further and further away from the shore of the waking world, deeper and deeper into the calm, quiet, and welcoming sea of sleep. There is nothing to hold on to now, nothing to do. It is time to simply let go. Asterisk. Let the quiet of the room be the only world you know. Let the gentle darkness behind your eyes be the only sky you see. There is nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to figure out. Let your thoughts soften. Let them unravel. Let them drift away like single autumn leaves on a slow, quiet stream. They are not important now. The only thing that is important is this feeling of peace, this gentle, heavy, wonderful feeling of rest, sinking softly now, deeper and deeper, into the warmth and the quiet. Each breath you take carries you further away from the waking world, and closer to the peaceful land of sleep. Your journey for today is over. Your only destination now is a deep and restful sleep. Asterisk. Your journey tonight is over. There is only quiet now, only peace. Sleep now. Sleep well, my friend. Good night.